At 52, life had settled into a quiet rhythm for Margot. The mornings were the same, filled with the familiar clang of the alarm clock, the gentle hum of the coffee machine, the soft rustle of the newspaper as she sipped her first cup of tea. She lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, a space that had once been filled with laughter and chatter, but now seemed to echo only with the quiet rustle of daily routine. Her children were grown, living in cities far away, and her friends, those who hadn't moved on to other chapters of their lives, were fewer than they once had been. Her world had shrunk in the past decade, or perhaps it had simply grown quieter. She wasn't lonely in the traditional sense. There was always something to do, a garden to tend, a book to read, a television show to watch. But the loneliness of silence lingered, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. The small, mundane rituals of her days became a comfort, a predictable pattern that allowed her to feel in control, even if there was little excitement left. It was on a Tuesday morning, one of those gray, unremarkable mornings that could have been any other, when she found herself at the grocery store. She was pushing her cart through the aisles, her mind absent as she selected the familiar items she always bought: milk, bread, eggs, fresh vegetables. The store was nearly empty, save for a few other early morning shoppers. And then, as she reached for a head of lettuce on the far end of the shelf, she caught sight of him. He was standing at the end of the aisle, looking at the selection of apples. Margot couldn't say what it was about him. Maybe it was the way his dark hair caught the light, or the intensity in the way he was focused on the fruit. But something about him made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't like anything she'd felt in years, maybe decades. It was a jolt of something unexpected, a spark of awareness. He wasn't remarkable in any traditional sense. Just an ordinary man in his 30s, dressed casually, his face familiar in its youth and vigor. But there was a quiet magnetism about him, something that drew her in. She glanced away quickly, not wanting to be caught staring. It was ridiculous, really. What was she doing, noticing a man like that? But the moment lingered in her mind, like the echo of a song that you couldn't quite place but couldn't forget. It would take only seconds, a brief exchange, for him to become just another face in the crowd. But in those moments, Margot felt something stir within her, a feeling she hadn't recognized in herself for years. The next few days unfolded much as any other. Yet as Margot walked through the aisles of the grocery store again, she couldn't help but wonder if she might run into him. It seemed absurd. What could a man like that have in common with her? She was just a woman on the brink of her 50s, trapped in a life of routine and quietude, and he was someone who, at least from the fleeting glimpse she had, seemed to be brimming with life, with possibilities. It was the following Thursday when it happened. She saw him again, standing in the same aisle, reaching for the same apples. Margot hesitated for a moment, then decided that perhaps she should speak to him. She had no real reason to, other than a quiet curiosity, a pull she couldn't explain. She cleared her throat and took a step closer. "Apples," she said, her voice soft, almost tentative. "You know, these are the best ones this time of year." He turned toward her, his expression shifting from mild surprise to a pleasant smile. "Really? I'm still getting used to all the different varieties. Which one do you recommend?" The conversation started easily, almost naturally, as if they had known each other for much longer than the brief encounters allowed. She felt herself relax in his presence, drawn to the easy way he engaged her, as if there were no boundaries between them, no age difference, no gaps in experience. It was as if they were simply two people talking about apples. "I like the Honeycrisps," she said with a smile. "They're sweet, but they've got a little tartness to them. Perfect balance." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'll give them a try." Their conversation moved from apples to other foods, to recipes, to the weather. There was a casual ease to their exchange, and before Margot knew it, they were standing at the checkout counter together, talking about little things, the kind of trivial things that, in the past, might have seemed unimportant but now felt like treasures, like small pieces of connection. As they exchanged a laugh over something ridiculous, she realized how comfortable she had become with him. It wasn't just the conversation, though that was a part of it. It was the way he made her feel seen, appreciated, as if there were a small part of her life worth talking about. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other often, always in the grocery store. Sometimes their chats were quick, Other times they stretched into long discussions about their lives, their work, the books they had read. She learned that his name was Alex, that he was an artist who worked with wood, and that he had just moved to the area from a nearby town. His energy was infectious, and for the first time in ages, Margot found herself looking forward to these brief encounters, cherishing their moments together in the otherwise mundane routine of her life. It wasn't much, just casual conversation, moments of shared laughter, but it felt like more than that to her. It felt like a bridge being built, one small exchange at a time, between two worlds, one young, filled with potential, and the other older, quieter, but with its own kind of wisdom. And Margot, for the first time in years, felt the stirrings of something more, a sense of connection that she couldn't quite name, but knew was real. It was late one afternoon, weeks after their first conversation, when Margot found herself standing in front of her kitchen window, a glass of wine in hand, staring out at the garden. The sun had just begun to set, casting a golden glow over the flowers she had tended to all summer. But her mind, usually so occupied with the small details of her home, kept drifting back to Alex. It had started innocently, hadn't it? Their casual conversations, the shared laughter, the way he made her feel seen in a way that no one had in years. But somewhere, buried beneath the surface of those friendly exchanges, a shift had begun. She had begun to look forward to their meetings with a warmth she couldn't quite explain. She found herself thinking of him at odd moments, when she was making dinner, when she was picking out a book to read, when she was folding laundry. It was as if he had become a part of her day in a way she had never expected. And then that evening, after another chance meeting in the store, this time, they had lingered for an hour, talking about everything from travel dreams to childhood memories. Margot realized something. It wasn't just his stories that had captivated her, or his smile that had become her favorite thing to see. It was the way he made her feel, alive, heard, seen. And beneath all of that, she could feel a stirring, a longing, a pull that she hadn't felt in decades. Her heart raced when she thought of him now, and she realized, with a sense of both fear and surprise, that it was no longer just friendship she was craving. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. She was beginning to fall for him. The realization hit her like a wave, unexpected, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. She stood there, still holding her wine, her thoughts spinning. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. There were so many reasons this couldn't work, so many reasons it shouldn't even be possible. The age gap alone, almost 20 years, was enough to make her doubt herself. She was no longer the young woman she had once been, and Alex was a man with a life ahead of him, with endless possibilities, with dreams that didn't include a middle-aged woman who had long ago settled into her own quiet world. The fear she felt wasn't just about their age difference, though that weighed heavily on her mind. It was the fear of rejection, the fear of realizing that her feelings might not be returned, the fear of being seen as something less than she was. But more than anything, it was the fear of the unknown, the fear of opening herself up to something she hadn't expected, something that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As she stood by the window, her thoughts consumed by him, she realized that she could no longer pretend this was just a passing fancy. Her feelings were real, and they were deepening with each passing day. And now, more than ever, she had to decide whether to keep these feelings hidden in the quiet corners of her heart, or to take the risk of letting them out into the world, risking everything for the chance of something that felt both impossible and beautiful. Margot spent the next few days caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Every time she thought of Alex, she felt her heart race, her pulse quicken with excitement and fear. It was as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, teetering between what could be and what should be. The joy she felt in his company was undeniable, but so was the fear, the gnawing sense that she was stepping into uncharted territory, a place where love and age would collide in ways that could leave her vulnerable. She found herself replaying their conversations over and over in her mind, searching for signs, for clues. Did he look at her the same way she looked at him? Did his smile linger a little longer when they talked? Or was she simply imagining things? There were moments when his gaze seemed to soften, when the world around them seemed to fade, and all that mattered was the space between them. But then, the doubts would creep in. He was young, full of potential and life. She was not. She was past the point in her life where a new beginning was even a realistic possibility, wasn't she? Margot couldn't shake the fear that his interest in her was simply a fluke, a fleeting curiosity. She was a woman who had lived through decades of experiences, who had seen love come and go, who had raised children and buried dreams. What could someone like her offer him, really? What would a man so young want with a woman like her? She imagined the looks, the judgment that might come from others if they knew. People would talk, people would question, people would whisper. She had always tried to live her life by the rules, avoiding the spotlight, avoiding anything that might draw attention. But now, in this quiet space of longing and uncertainty, she couldn't help but wonder, what if the rules didn't matter anymore? The emotional pull she felt toward Alex was so intense it made her question everything. Her life, her choices, her identity. She had spent so many years alone, wrapped in the comfort of solitude, that the thought of opening herself up to another person, to intimacy, to vulnerability, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Could she allow herself to fall for him? Could she risk her heart, knowing full well the complications it could bring? What if she was only chasing something that could never be, a fleeting moment that would only leave her with more regret than joy? The fear of rejection gnawed at her. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if, like everyone else, he saw her as someone who had outlived her time, someone whose days of romance were far behind her? And yet, despite the doubts, despite the voices of caution inside her head, there was a flicker of hope, a tiny, fragile hope that refused to be extinguished. In the quiet moments of reflection, when the noise of the world seemed distant, she realized something. She didn't want to live her life in the shadows of what might have been. She didn't want to hide her feelings away, bury them under layers of doubt and fear. The thought of never knowing what could be with Alex, of never even trying, was a fate far worse than the risk of falling, of failing. Margot didn't know where this would lead, or if it was even possible for someone like her and someone like him to find something meaningful together. But the thought of not trying felt like the greatest betrayal, to herself, to the woman she was becoming, to the woman who was still capable of feeling deeply, of loving fiercely, of living in a way that wasn't confined by the limitations others placed on her. As she stood in front of the mirror that night, looking at the woman staring back at her, Margot made a decision. She wouldn't let fear hold her back anymore. If she wanted this, if she wanted something more with Alex, she would have to take the first step. The next move would be hers, and she would no longer wait for life to pass her by. She would create her own path, no matter how uncertain it felt. The decision, once made, seemed simple, clear in its truth. Yet, as Margot stood in her kitchen the next morning, preparing a meal she had no real reason to cook, she realized how much courage it would take. The ingredients in front of her, a small chicken, fresh herbs, vegetables, seemed like a metaphor for the gathering of her own thoughts. The way she was trying to piece together a moment, a conversation, something that could bridge the divide between fantasy and reality. She had never been one to take risks, to push boundaries. Her life had always been about comfort, about control, about the quiet certainty that came from predictability. But now, she found herself standing at the edge of something unknown, something exciting, and it terrified her. The idea of inviting Alex over for dinner, of opening her home to him in a way she hadn't done for anyone in years, felt like a step too far, too vulnerable, too much of an exposure of herself. But then again, what was the alternative? To continue with these quiet, unspoken feelings, to pretend that the connection she felt was nothing more than a passing fancy? No, she had come too far, allowed herself to feel too much, to retreat now. If she wanted to explore where this could go, she needed to be bold, to take the plunge into the unknown. It wasn't so much about the dinner, it was about the invitation itself. It was the first time she would be offering him something more than the fleeting moments in the grocery store, the quick exchanges of polite words. This would be something more intimate, something that would allow them both to step outside the world of chance meetings and into something more tangible, something real. She took a deep breath and picked up the phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed his number, the familiar sensation of doubt creeping in. What if he didn't want this? What if he had only enjoyed their conversations because they were brief, because there was no expectation attached? But as the phone rang and she heard his voice on the other end, warm and familiar, those doubts began to fade. "Alex," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner sometime. I've got a recipe I've been wanting to try, and it would be nice to share it with someone." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that felt like an eternity to Margot. She held her breath, unsure of what he would say. But then, his voice broke through the silence, and she heard the smile in it. "That sounds great, Margot. I'd love to." When? Her heart gave a small leap of joy, and she felt something warm spread through her chest. It wasn't a rejection, nor was it a casual agreement. There was something genuine in his response, something that made her believe he was as eager for this as she was. She smiled softly to herself, the tension lifting from her shoulders. "How about Friday? I'll have everything ready by then." "Friday it is," he replied. "I'm looking forward to it." As she hung up the phone, a wave of nervous excitement washed over her. She had done it. She had opened the door to something new, something unknown. And though the future was uncertain, though her heart still fluttered with doubt, she knew one thing for sure. This was a step she had to take. There was no going back now. The evening arrived, and with it, a mix of anticipation and nerves that Margot had never quite experienced before. She had spent the entire day preparing, transforming her simple kitchen into a space of warmth and hospitality. The scent of roasting chicken filled the air, mingling with the earthy aroma of rosemary and thyme. The table was set, not too fancy, but enough to suggest that this evening was special, that it was different from anything she had experienced in a long time. She had dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue blouse that made her feel comfortable but still put together. Her hair, usually tied back in a simple knot, fell loosely around her shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of age slipping away, replaced by a sense of possibility, of being seen not just as someone's mother or neighbor, but as a woman, alive, capable, and yearning for something more. When the doorbell rang, Margot's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting, but seeing Alex standing there, dressed casually but neatly, his eyes warm with that familiar, easy smile, made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. But then, as if by instinct, she stepped forward, opening the door wide, and he stepped into her home. "Hey," he said softly, his voice both comforting and full of excitement. "It smells amazing in here." Margot smiled, her nerves momentarily easing as he stepped inside, the moment feeling right, as if it had been waiting for both of them to arrive at this point. "Come in, please," she said, motioning toward the kitchen. "Everything's just about ready." They sat down to dinner with an ease that surprised her. The conversation flowed effortlessly, punctuated by laughter and small stories, of Alex's childhood, of her own memories of raising her children, of books they had read and places they dreamed of visiting. It felt like they were catching up, as though they had been friends for much longer than they actually had. But there was something more, too. Something that wasn't in the words, but in the way their eyes met across the table, in the soft way their laughter intertwined. In the quiet moments, when they were both still, the connection between them seemed to hum, a shared understanding that went deeper than the surface of their words. As the evening wore on, the conversation began to slow, becoming more intimate. They had finished their meal, and the wine had softened the edges of their awareness. They found themselves sitting on the couch, close enough that Margot could feel the warmth of Alex's presence beside her. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, and the only thing that mattered was the connection they shared in that small, quiet space. For a moment, there was silence between them, an unspoken understanding that both of them felt, but neither of them acknowledged aloud. Alex turned toward her, his gaze soft, and she met it, her heart beating louder than it had all evening. And then, without warning, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. The gesture was simple, gentle, but it held so much meaning, more than Margot could put into words. She felt the warmth of his touch spread through her, like a slow-burning fire, and for the first time, she realized just how much she had wanted this closeness, this intimacy, this feeling of being seen not just for her years or her responsibilities, but as a woman, as someone who could still be desired, still be loved. Alex's hand remained near her face, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, almost hesitant. "I've wanted this for a while, Margot. I've wanted to spend time with you like this." Her breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. She was overwhelmed, swept up in the sudden rush of emotions that had been building within her for weeks. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that there was no need for words. There was only the truth of the moment, the undeniable connection that had been growing between them, quietly but steadily. And in that moment, everything she had feared, every doubt, every hesitation faded away. What they had was real. What they had was right. It didn't matter what others might think, or what might come next. For the first time in a long while, Margot felt as though she was exactly where she was meant to be, her heart open and vulnerable, ready to embrace whatever came next. As the days passed following that evening, Margot found herself reflecting more and more on what had transpired between her and Alex. She had always been someone who lived by routines, by the steady rhythms of her life. But now, there was something that had shifted inside her, a stirring that was both delicate and fierce, a quiet revolution of the heart. The age difference still lingered in her mind, but it no longer seemed like an obstacle. Instead, it felt like something to be embraced, something that gave their connection a depth she hadn't anticipated. She had spent years believing that love belonged to the young, that passion was the domain of those whose futures were still unwritten. But now, with Alex, she was learning that love was not bound by age, not defined by years or expectations. Love was about presence, about vulnerability, about the willingness to be open to another person, no matter the stage of life you found yourself in. Margot thought about the way Alex had looked at her that night, the way his touch had sent a ripple of warmth through her. She realized that, for all the years that had passed, she had never really stopped longing for that kind of connection. The kind that made you feel truly seen, truly known. The years had not dulled her ability to love, to desire, to feel passion. If anything, they had made her more aware of its preciousness. She also realized something else, that love wasn't about the grand gestures, the sweeping declarations. It was about the quiet moments, the way Alex had listened to her, the way he made her feel like the most important person in the room. It was in the small details, the simple acts of kindness, the shared silences that said more than words ever could. As she sat in her garden one morning, the sunlight warming her skin, she thought about all the ways she had held herself back over the years, all the time she had silenced her own desires out of fear or propriety. And now, with Alex, she was finally allowing herself to feel, to live, to love without apology. For so long, she had let the world's judgments shape her choices, but now, she was learning to trust her own heart. Age had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that it didn't define who she was or what she could still experience. She had spent so many years thinking that her best years were behind her, that she was too old for new beginnings. But Alex had shown her that it was never too late to feel alive, to open your heart, to let love into your life when you least expected it. Margot didn't know where this path would lead, or what the future would hold for her and Alex. But she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer afraid. She was no longer confined by the limitations of her past. Love, she realized, was not about age or time or what the world expected. It was about the depth of your connection, the honesty of your emotions, and the courage to pursue it, no matter the obstacles. And as she looked ahead, she couldn't help but smile, knowing that the best part of her journey was just beginning. As Margot sat on the porch one evening, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. The world around her, once so predictable and quiet, now seemed full of possibilities. She had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that was not defined by the expectations of others or the passing of time, but by the simple, powerful truth of her own desires and choices. The love she had found with Alex had not been something she had sought or planned for. It had come unexpectedly, like a quiet storm, gentle yet unstoppable. And though it had required her to face fears she hadn't even realized she carried, to challenge the assumptions she had lived by for so long, it had also given her a new sense of freedom. She had learned that love did not have an expiration date, that it was not something confined to a certain stage of life. Love could bloom at any age, in any circumstance, when two hearts were open enough to let it in. She thought back to the first time she had met Alex, to that ordinary day in the grocery store, when she had never imagined that one brief conversation could change everything. How strange it seemed now, that something so simple could have turned her world upside down in the most beautiful way. But in a way it made perfect sense. Life was full of the unexpected. Those moments that changed you, that pushed you to question everything you thought you knew. Looking back on her journey, Margot felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had learned to embrace her own worth, to trust her instincts, to seek out joy without shame. She had learned that the heart was a powerful thing, capable of loving deeply no matter the circumstances, no matter the years. The relationship with Alex had taught her that she was still capable of growth, still capable of feeling more than she ever thought possible. And as she sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margot knew that this wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. The future was wide open, filled with moments yet to be lived, with love yet to be explored. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came her way. She had opened her heart, and in doing so, she had found something beautiful and unexpected. For anyone else who might have doubted, who might have believed that love was something meant for the young, Margot wanted to offer her story as a testament to the truth. Love has no limits, no expiration date. It is there for the taking at any age for anyone brave enough to seek it. And for her, it had arrived when she least expected it, reminding her that the heart's capacity to love could never be measured by time. It was limitless. She smiled softly to herself, letting the last of the day's light warm her face. She had lived through many seasons of life, but this season of love was the one that mattered most. And she was finally ready to embrace it fully, without fear, without regret. Love, after all, was timeless.